Uber faces a lawsuit from Google.
Uber admitted it failed to disclose a massive data breach.
Uber is losing gobs of money.
A former Uber engineer says she was propositioned by her boss on her first day.
Uber CEO Travis Kalanick resigning overnight.
It led Uber to finally understand that it had to make the changes that it is making as a company to break from the past.
Welcome, Dara.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right. Well, you're clearly moving at warp speed, right? Absolutely warp speed to try to fix things that we've seen at Uber. So before we go into anything else, I mean, what is going to make me feel safer since you took over as a woman getting into an Uber?
I hope a lot. We actually decided at Uber, two of the values that we hold very core to Uber is, one is the freedom to move, the freedom to have transportation available to you anytime, anywhere. And then the freedom of opportunity, because movement and opportunity go together. And we decided this year to add safety to that core freedom. Safety is something that everyone deserves. And it became our #1 priority for 2018. And listen, I think being in an Uber is safer than being in a cab. You're de-anonymized. You know exactly who your driver is, and your driver knows who you are. Your GPS signal is followed, so people know where you are. But this week, we launched a number of features in the app. For example, you have a 911 button in the app. We're testing now sending your location directly to the 911 center. So if something happens, 911 immediately knows where you are. And response time is absolutely important in cases of emergencies to making sure that those emergencies are settled in a positive manner. We are also investing really heavily in background checks as it relates to our drivers, rerunning background checks on an annual basis, and then also on a near real-time basis, looking at whether there are any driving infractions. For example, if there's a DUI, we don't want to be looking that up on an annual basis. We want to know that something happened and take action on it so that you, as a rider, feel safe with your driver. So we're making big investments on the safety side. We've got Jay Johnson, who was the head of Homeland Security, is now the chairman of our safety advisory board, and we want to make Uber the safest transportation platform on earth. And I think if we do that, the business will take care of itself. So it's something that we're pretty dedicated to.
Well, before you came on board at Uber, former Attorney General Eric Holder was brought in to do this internal investigation.
Yeah.
And it was never published. It's a confidential report.
Yeah.
You've read that report, right?
Yes, I have.
What was the most disturbing thing that you learned reading that report?
It was the whole thing. Okay, it was just, it was one thing after the other. And I have to tell you, I was sitting down and you couldn't take the report home with you. It's pretty sensitive, and it deals with personnel and specific people, so we have to respect their privacy. But honestly, it was like you read one thing, and it's bad, and then you read another, and another, and another, and another, and I had to take breaks reading this thing.
You had to go and lie down.
Because it was this core culture that had to do with power allowing you to get away with behavior that was otherwise unacceptable. And you know, the company, to its credit, did a thorough investigation, brought in Eric Holder, took real action, fired 20 people, but it reflected a core culture where the success of the company hid real cultural elements or cultural rot inside. until one thing led to another, and the whole thing broke down, and then, you know, leadership changed, and ultimately leadership there was held accountable. But it was a tough read, and it was a tougher thing for the company to go through, and it's something that we are still recovering from, but I do think that we're recovering from it. And there is a part of a crisis like this. The crisis was so big that my ability to come in and say, we've got to do things differently, actually was easy. I didn't have to convince anyone because the company knew that we had to change.
Well, I was going to ask you, you know, why did you want to come in and into this hot mess, right? I mean, you had a wonderful job. You were running Expedia.
I did have a wonderful job, yeah.
You were very successful at Expedia. What was the appeal of coming into this?
So I tell employees or young folks, and I'm no longer one of them, 3 pieces of advice in thinking about their career. First of all, work with people that you like. I wasn't able to do my diligence there, but I met the board, and even though the board has a bad reputation, individually they were terrific. Second is, I would say, go work at a place where you as an individual can make a difference. And the third is, go to a place that's making a difference in the world. So for number 2 and number 3, when I thought about Uber, and honestly, at first when they called, I said, no way, I'm doing great. I have a boss that I love, Barry Diller. I've been there for 13 years. Why would I ever do this? But number 2 and number 3, go to a place where you can make a difference, at a place that's making a difference in the world. I couldn't check those off, you know, better than this opportunity. This is a company that I believe is important for the world. This is a company that is providing opportunity for 3 million driver partners all around the world, and I believe that we will be a fundamental part of transportation and mobility in cities everywhere. So I had to take a shot, and I was in a position in my life where I could take a risk, and why the hell not?
Well,
thank you.
So one of the things that you thought about when you arrived, I gather, was that you seriously considered shutting down the self-driving unit.
Yeah.
And you had obviously a lot of misgivings about it. So when you learned about this tragic death of the pedestrian recently in Arizona who was hit by a self-driving car, what did it tell you about those original misgivings? Did it validate the misgivings, and what were they?
So the misgivings weren't necessarily about what happened in Tempe, and it was a true tragedy in Tempe. The misgivings were about companies focusing on what they're good at and not on what they're good at. And my view as it relates to Uber is that Uber is a transportation network. We're not a manufacturer of cars. We don't care whether it's a Ford or a Toyota, et cetera. Therefore, why should we be developing self-driving technology? As it turns out, the development of self-driving technology is incredibly important to take the cost per mile down of using an Uber in order for us to become truly cost competitive with car ownership.
Because there are no more drivers.
There are no more drivers, although I think that's 15 years down the road. It's a long, long time. And if you think about automation, the drama behind automation is like everything is automated or not, when in fact automation goes hybrid for a very long time. You look at manufacturing, it's people and machines working together, and I think that self-driving will be the same thing. You're not going to have robot cars everywhere. You're going to have a combination of robot cars and drivers, and if you get to a world where we become competitive cost-wise with car ownership, today a lot of people think about Uber as being a big company. We represent less than 0.5% of miles driven in the United States. When self-driving prices become competitive with car ownership, then I believe we will be 20, 30, 40% of miles driven. This is a company that's going to be 50 times bigger. At that point, even if you assume that 80% of your miles driven are driven by robots, you're going to need 20% of something that's 50 times bigger. You're still going to need more drivers. So for me, whether or not we wanted to be autonomous or not was based on what's fundamental to our future. I do believe autonomous is now fundamental to our future. The accident in Arizona was something that I could have never imagined. At this point, we're working with authorities to get them all the information that they need to understand exactly what happened. That's not our job, that's their job, and we want to give them all the data to do that. In the meantime, I am doing a top-to-bottom audit of all of our safety procedures, the safety drivers, the software, et cetera, so that myself and the ATG team can feel absolutely satisfied that when we get out to the road again, and all of our autonomous cars at this point are grounded, when we get out to the road again, and we will get out to the road, we do so in as safe a manner as possible. This was a tragedy, but ultimately these robot cars, they're going to be better drivers than humans are.
Well, let's just talk about the hearings we've just been watching with Mark Zuckerberg.
What hearings?
I'm sure you caught them, right? What was the most important thing, you think, to emerge from the 2 days that we've just gone through with Zuckerberg on Capitol Hill?
I thought it was fun, the interchange between the senators and Mark. But I think for me, it's a bigger theme in that a lot of companies like ourselves, technology companies in Silicon Valley, have hid behind this idea that we're just building platforms. We're just building platforms. What human beings do with these platforms is not our responsibility. Humans are good, humans are bad, but it's not our responsibility what they do with our platforms. And I think that what we, and I'll say we, I know this is a Facebook problem, but I think this is a technology issue. What we fail to understand is that these platforms allow human beings to essentially get like nuclearized. You know, the reach of a person who is not a good person in real life, maybe 10 people, maybe 20 people, on these platforms, it's thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. So these platforms allow behavior to be amplified in a way that can be wonderful and also can be destructive as well. And when you create these platforms that can amplify with the power of a platform like Facebook, you start having to take responsibility. And I don't think that it was you know, Facebook was trying to shirk it one way or the other. I think there's this idealism in Silicon Valley where we feel very unsafe in making editorial choices. I know you've been making editorial choices your whole life. Technologies don't feel safe doing so. How do you make these calls? How do you make these choices? And I think we're wishing for a world where we didn't have to. And I think that world's over.
Well, it certainly is. Zuckerberg said, interestingly, that he thought that regulation was inevitable. So what regulation do you suggest?
Oh,
I mean, there's been a lot about...
You didn't tell me you were going to ask me that question.
I keep hearing about, well, if it's good regulation. What is the good regulation?
My honest answer is I don't know. I mean, we've been dealing with regulation city by city. We've been dealing with transportation regulation, and it's difficult, it's a pain, but ultimately it creates controls that are good, and it helps save lives, and it creates a level playing field, and they're not perfect. I can just tell you what's happening now has to change, and some kind of regulatory framework should be put in place, and I haven't thought long enough about what that looks like.
I'll follow up with my team, in other words.
Yeah.
Remember that? Okay. So, I mean, you came into Uber when there had been a series of debacles, which meant that the management were cleaned out. Should the same thing happen at Facebook?
I think that...
I mean, there's a lot of debacles.
So I think that management understands that they made a big mistake. I think they are taking responsibility. And I think this is their chance to prove themselves, and I hope that they do.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, Uber had its own data breach in 2016, which it also kept secret for more than a year. How can we be sure that that won't happen again?
Because I'm in charge.
Good answer. All right. So, of course, you've now come in and you're reforming the cowboy culture that we've talked about. And what are you actually doing to change that culture? Because people love to parrot along about, diversity training and where sexual harassment is just about, new norms and so on. What are you actually doing to change the culture, particularly for women? Because women really were, a horrible part of the Travis Kalanick era, the sense that they had been disregarded and, and not treated right, etc. How are you fixing it?
So the culture and I think the publicity that the company had, et cetera, was so negative that the good news is that the culture started changing from the bottoms up even before I got there. So I can't take credit for it. There are these employee resource groups, women in engineering, who believe in the company and started taking control. And they're like, we're not going to take this shit anymore, and we are going to talk about this, and we're going to reform the culture bottoms up. And I think that, great cultures are not top-down driven. It's a combination of bottoms up and top down. So when I took over, one of the first things that we did was we actually went out and crowdsourced what we thought the new values and norms of the company should be, and it came from the bottoms up, and I was much more like an editor rather than coming up with the actual values. We call them norms because they're about behaviors, and there are a number of them, but like two that really ring true to a lot of people within the company is, one is we celebrate differences. We want to be a different kind of company, but more than that, we want people of every kind, employees of every kind, regardless of their background, regardless of if they're comfortable being an individual contributor or they have a big personality or they run teams, we all want them to contribute. And if you're different, we celebrate that. We're not going to have a bunch of folks who are the same, who are kind of the leadership of this company. And the second for us is for us to always do the right thing, period, and everyone knows exactly what that means. Now it's our job to put those norms and cultures into everyday life. And I think that, we're on a good path, but I can't tell you here that we're perfect. It's early, but I can tell you that the company knows that they need to change, and we're on our path, and I think we're going to prove it out in 2 to 3 years.
Well, I don't know whether to laugh or cry when I read a recent survey about women in tech, because 1,000 people were asked to name a female leader in tech, and the names that most people came up with, the majority of names they came up with, were Siri and Alexa, okay? Okay, so, I mean, that was pretty tragic. There's so many women who are COOs of these companies, but they never get to be CEO. And we're always hearing in these big swinging male conferences where they go around talking about, we have this great pipeline of women, but that pipeline seems pretty congested, right? So my question is, how is your pipeline, Dara? When is the oil going to start gushing?
Another easy question from Tina. So I actually think this is, I do think that it takes time and it takes investment to make this happen. I think that there are too many companies who, when they talk about women in leadership, they focus on recruitment. And by the way, we have focused on recruitment, and we have a much more diverse candidate set coming into the company, but I firmly believe in development. And development takes time. And it's not a fast twitch kind of solution to the problem. But when I was at Expedia, we put a plan in place where we had about women in senior positions. There were about 50% of the employee population was women. But if you look at director and above, 15% were women. And Barry and I put a target that we were going to double that in 7 years. We put half of our own bonus at risk. We reported to the board about that. And we were able to, while I was there, moved it from 15% to close to 25%. It took years to do so because it took developing women, shaping them, working with their culture, making sure that you move them to the right place within the company. And it took time, but with investment and with time, we got there. I think that the focus on recruitment is a little bit of a sugar high, because then all you're doing is there are women who are qualified at senior position, and it's like a bidding war with them. And the fact is that everybody needs mentorship, everybody needs development, and my focus at Uber isn't going to be to get a sugar high. It's going to be to develop the great women that we already have at Uber and to make them be great senior women at Uber.
Mm-hmm. Well,
she doesn't look like she's buying it, by the way.
I'm listening. I hear you. It's not just about recruiting. It's about how you manage them when they get there. obviously, you've talked about having a diverse workforce at Uber, and of course, you are an immigrant yourself. I mean, you came to the US when you were 9 years old from Iran, and you're actually a refugee from the regime, when the Shah was toppled. So, and your extended family is just enormously successful. I mean, you have so many incredible high achievers in your family. So how did being an immigrant from Iran, how has that shaped your leadership sort of philosophy?
So the first thing that shaped my philosophy is my mom, who's in the crowd someplace here. So you can raise your hand, Mom. Go ahead. So I think if I were an immigrant or not an immigrant with a mother like that, I'd be just fine. So thank you, Mom. But I do think, listen, I was lucky enough to be an immigrant during a time in this country when they welcomed immigrants. And I think that Americans take things for granted. I can't tell you how excited we were when we went for that green card interview and how nervous we were. And when we got that green card, it was like this, it was a gold card. It was like a treasure. You can't believe how relieved we were. This is an amazing country. We're so, so blessed to be here. And I think that not taking things for granted and understanding how freaking lucky we were to be here is what drove us. It's like, you can't let this gift go. And my mom and dad lost almost everything in Iran, but they paid for a great private school education for myself and my 3 brothers. And while they never told us this, we expect you to not waste this wonderful gift, we knew it. And that drive was a part of my family, and it's part of the broader part of my family. Education was always something that was treasured, and the combination of understanding just how lucky you are, the combination of valuing education above all else, and then having a family that was so close-knit, it all worked. And I consider myself incredibly lucky to be sitting up here with you as a result.
Well, I just want to ask a last question because we're out of time. I could talk to you for much longer, but we've heard so much about the dark side of tech already, right? We keep hearing of the dark side of tech, the dark side of tech. Tell me something that I should be really excited about. You're a father of 4 kids. What do you think, what do you see, aside from medical things, which we know are going to be amazing with tech, but what do you see in the flying car future?
So I see a world where there is no car ownership, and I think it's an awesome world. If you look at cars lay idle 95% of the time. Parking takes up to 25 to 30% of space in cities. And I think what's really cool about what we're trying to do is that if mobility and movement is available to everybody, then the value of real estate in the middle of Manhattan versus the value of, let's say, real estate in Queens the delta between the two starts diminishing. I think that bringing the cost of movement down, I think ultimately creates opportunity for more and more people and makes a society that hopefully is more equal, that has opportunity on a much, much broader basis. And for me, that's why I come to work every morning. Okay, well, one last question. If Susan Fowler, who wrote that amazingly explosive blog about the culture at Uber, if she reapplied for a job at Uber, would you hire her? Definitely.
I hear that, Susan Fowler. Thank you.